Yeah, it's a great question. I run into it a lot in some of the sectors that I advise in, which is, when the economy's going good and profitability is up, maybe we'll pay a little extra money for a substrate that is a little more sustainable than the current plastic, let's say, that I'm utilizing. And that's all fair, but where I would say that the evolution of this is no longer just on that one for one evaluation of, is this a sustainable material or is this a plastic? And the reason for that is, first and foremost, all of these factors are driving the financial markets. So a company that is not looking at this holistically is missing the point that they're being evaluated by the financial markets, either through their investors, through their debt and capital raises, the cost of money, because the organizations that are holding the Benjamins, so to speak, in terms of the loans and the related investments, are looking at these ESG factors. They're not looking at, are you removing plastic from your supply chain? That's one element, but they want to know, what's your commitment to the waste circularity or closed loop of your waste overall? What are the labor issues on who's making your product? They want to know downline of your supply chain, how the product's being made, what are your human human impact compliance and types of activities that are there. They're looking at greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not just, did I change out my plastic for a sustainable paper? They want to know how that good or service was shipped to the store or shipped to your convention center, and what was the footprint of that. So the equation of looking at the total cost is changing, and the financial markets in ESG are looking at it from that more holistic perspective of what is that cost that's very different than how I think we all used to look at what was the cost of a good or service that was maybe green. The other thing I would say is that there is a great deal of pressure that's now on the supply chain that's coming from, if you think of it this way, the financial markets put enormous pressure on the C-suites of publicly traded companies. So what happens? Those C-suites start to go downline into their procurement, into their operations, and then procurement and operations go into their supply chain. So where you're probably used to seeing in that supply chain, now they're starting to be asked a lot of questions about what is this material? How did you get it here to our location? And I think what you're seeing probably already, some of your venues that host your events, they have standards and guidelines now that they won't allow you to bring in plastics. They won't allow you to bring in items that may not have a waste disposition or waste diversion strategy or a repurposing. So there's a lot of change that's happening beyond, am I buying this good or service because it has plastic today and I could have a green alternative tomorrow? Much more holistic.
Yeah, I think, Lou, you bring up a big point there. And, it's the point that I'm making with our clients and our partners, saying, hey, I'm going to bring in a more diverse workplace, check. Oh, let's separate our plastic, paper, and the other materials we're disposing of, check. So it's just not going to be that way. You had to put a ring on this. You can't date it. You got to marry it. You got to be all the way in, but you really need to understand what that is. And you've used the keyword a few times, authenticity. And again, our industry is coming no matter what. I know I keep saying I'm the harbinger of these types of programs, but I know your next transition really is the why. And I know you've touched on that a bit, but this is a beginning. I know this is a beginning topic, but it's great that you're making these profound points.
Well, and there's another thing I think we all need to consider. I'm obviously on the senior end of this and kind of in my legacy of my career. And I'm fascinated by the Gen Z and the millennials that are a big part of what's driving this. And, millennials and even Gen Zs today are in positions of strong influence in decision-making. And, they're looking at making decisions that are very different than when I was maybe younger in my career and dealing with someone on the procurement or the purchasing side. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is, it's often stated in many different circles that, we're in a timing of the greatest wealth transfer in the history of our country, right? So our age and up, had very good fortunes in their careers, and all that wealth is transferring to our younger Gen Z and millennial kids and their families, and they're making different decisions. They're driving different influences and setting up different standards. And I'll leave the last comment on this to what we're seeing that is proof points for me is large enterprise type companies are modifying their request for proposals. So the procurement side is already starting to change. They want to know, as a supplier, no matter how large or small you are, public or private, they want to know certain factors, and it's changing pretty aggressively. What certifications do you have against various different benchmarks? They want to know about waste strategies. They want to know about greenhouse gas emissions. So to your audience and to our audience, what I would say is get out in front of this, right? This is why we should care. It's coming. And the more that we can understand the constituents that we deal with, the stakeholders we deal with, especially the larger companies, the public companies that we do business with, my message is we need to get out in front of it. And those that do will win. So hopefully that answered your question.
Well, I think Sterling, thank you very much. I hope that does.
Yes, absolutely.
Sterling, I know from your side of it, you've been a part of the largest multicultural agency in the world. You've been a part of some of the biggest campaigns, most memorable campaigns that are out there. And your partner Ed Boyd with Connect the Dots. You guys are seeing things from a very long runway to where we are now. What would your thoughts be, your advice to the marketplace as people are talking diversity, making real change, talking about being a multicultural voice to industry or to business? What would your advice be to some of our peers out there?
Well, you mentioned earlier authenticity,
Yeah.
and I think authenticity comes into strong play when it comes to the diversity market. How do you hire, but also how do you spend? So if ESG is going to be that component that can help companies be really dedicated, married, not just dating, the concept of being socially conscious, that's something that we're very much interested in seeing if that takes shape. Is it a trend, or is it something that we see long term? So one of the things that I have a question with, Lou, and I think you established where the E is coming from, but when it comes to the S, is it a situation of, are they looking at companies on how they hire within diversity or how they spend within diversity? Can you kind of give the audience a little, clarity on where that part of the acronym?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just one quick transition point that I want to share to give you kind of some real numbers of why you should care. So you probably have heard of Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. He gets a lot of credit for kind of accelerating the movement, and that company is growing so much. I think the one quote I had in one of my last presentations was $7 trillion invested in companies. Now it's up to $9 trillion, I believe, invested in companies, taking big stakes. And his statement consistently is, you're at risk of our investment if you don't adopt these ESG type of factors. So there's real money here. That's just one entity. So, but Sterling, back to the social aspect of it, it's lagged. There's been for us ESG professionals, there's been more of a lag. It's been more challenging to really zero in on what are those social factors that rise to the top and then can be implemented or acted upon. And because it was much easier to identify the environmental sustainable solutions. But 2020 changed the game. And not only on, I happen to live here in Minneapolis, so very much, George Floyd and all that took place in our city, and then seeing what happened globally. The social injustice topic has really changed corporate boardrooms and companies overall. And unfortunately, there's some situations that have, I would say, turned ESG into a much more era of accountability. Because in the reaction to what took place in 2020, you saw a lot of companies making declarations and pledges. we're going to donate 500 million to Black Lives Matter or the United Negro College Fund, or we're going to do this, and and it was declarations, right? And ESG came in and said, we're going to hold this accountable. Like, you need to report. There needs to be transparency. We need to see exactly what you're doing, and you need to report on it. And that's where the ESG movement is going. It's era of accountability and really holding the feet to the fire against all these declarations. But more specifically, you're seeing an enormous movement around the HR side of the business in terms of looking at diversity and inclusion, equity, in the hiring process, in the composition of leadership, in how the board is compiled and put together. And then also health and safety. I can't express enough how important this is, not only for the consumer, but for your employees, right? Is taking a whole different approach to looking at the employee side of this. And there's so much happening around buildings, for example, the return to work. Are they safe? What's the air quality? What retrofits should we be making? So there's a lot of investment that's going into the health and safety side of this, but it's still an area that is lagging where the E is, and S needs to come up more. And then lastly, I'll share with you, there's a very big element of this around the communities or the risks that go outside of what we think of as traditional climate. Unfortunately, the underserved populations are in some of the worst areas for climate impact, right? For climate change. There's a lot of work being done around the commercial real estate about what happens if public transportation is cut off from the homes and areas where the workforce lives in those areas. So anyway, I could go on and on about that, but suffice to say, the S is coming. The era of accountability is real. And I'm really excited to see where this is going to continue to evolve.
Mike, any thoughts you have as we're covering some of the ground?
Yeah, Lou, Don here. Can you add a little perspective in the news recently? Israel, Unilever banned the sale of Ben & Jerry's in the occupied territories. I don't know if it's all of Israel, but that would be like a global example of what you're talking about, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And there's some real, it's a tough topic for these publicly traded companies, right? You could take that, you could look at Nike with Colin Kaepernick, you can look at Patagonia, with the political elections and such. So some of these companies say, it may hurt my organization in the short term. It's someone like CVS when they took cigarettes out, right? No tobacco was ever sold. It was billions of dollars of revenue to their organization, and they took it out because they were going towards their values, towards their purpose, and that is all tied into this ESG. So Ben & Jerry's, again, wherever you sit in terms of looking at them as an organization, they stay on their task. They're true to their purpose, and they make those decisions. And the followers, the supporters, the consumers, and the financial markets that embrace them love that, and it ties very much into that authenticity of their ESG.
Yeah, thanks for the explanation. Maybe they'll come out with a flavor called West Bank or something.
I do have one, if I could ask.
Sure.
A minute ago, when you were in your introduction, you said a statement that grabbed me and I'm thinking, if I put myself in the shoes of an entrepreneur or a business owner, you said, I'm paraphrasing again, you said something about, and you're going to be scored by it. Can you explain that to me as to how that, and maybe it's coming up in your notes somewhere, but I don't want to jump the gun, but how is Mr. Business Owner in the marketplace? How does he know what to do in order to get a good score? For a test, to get a score, you got to study, you got to know your stuff, and maybe some of this stuff's applicable, some's not. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, great question, Mike. So let me frame it this way, and I'm going to start with the enterprise publicly traded organizations.
Sure.
So they are actually scored on their E, the S, and the G, and then the total. And currently, there are multiple standards that are out there. You'll hear terms like GRI and CDP and SASB. So there's all these different standards. And that's a challenge, right? Because there's not one standard.